Okay, so elasticity. Which of you understand consumer price elasticity? Any of you? Okay. Wage elasticity is not any different other than the terminology is different. But the metrics are virtually identical. Okay? So I want to think about a couple of conditions. And I apologize, I don't recall your first name.
My name's Catherine.
Catherine, thank you. I remembered that it started with a K or K sound, but I wanted to say Kim, and I was a little concerned. Kim, Catherine, George, Ringo, whoever you are, if you have a brain tumor, and the only way you're going to live is to find a brain surgeon, how much will you pay for that brain surgeon?
A lot.
In fact, wouldn't you probably pay anything and everything you had available or could possibly have available, because if you don't find them, you're dead? Isn't that probably true? So we might suggest then that your demand for a brain surgeon, you just need one of them, at any price, you demand that brain surgeon. At any wage that you need to pay, you demand that brain surgeon, right? Is the brain surgeon very substitutable? If I'm a ditch digger, would you let me, Catherine, do your brain surgery?
No.
Why not? I mean, a brain surgeon just digs a very, very tiny ditch in your head, takes out some product, closes the hole back up, right? Isn't that just digging a ditch?
Needs to be more specific than that.
Yeah, we might want some expertise that your average ditch digger doesn't have, right? Is it likely that a brain surgeon can dig a ditch? Yeah. Well, I think maybe somebody that digs ditches all day can probably, and does it every day, can probably dig a ditch faster, can dig a ditch maybe straighter, more uniformly deep. They probably don't get tired as fast because they're used to doing it. They're probably better at it. But at the end of the day, a brain surgeon could be a ditch digger. It's not a very perfect substitute for a manual laborer ditch digger, but a ditch digger, I guess it could be a brain surgeon, but I think we'd all agree it's a very imperfect substitute. Chances of a brain surgeon being able to dig a ditch and nobody dying is probably pretty good. Chances of a ditch digger doing brain surgery and nobody dying, not so good, right? I'm pretty sure if I let a ditch digger do brain surgery, I'm probably gone pretty quick. Okay. So very imperfect substitutes. So we're about to talk about elasticity and inelasticity as a function of substitutability. So if I need ditch diggers, and there's a whole market of people of varying levels of skill and varying levels of ability, but all of them could dig a ditch, then what dictates how I'm going to pay them and how many I'm going to use? It's going to be my price. It's not going to be the number available, because we just said anybody can dig a ditch, right? So we want all of them, or any of them that we can find, at a certain wage. But if we had to pay more than that wage, we don't want them at all, do we? We know we don't have to pay more than that wage, because Lindy, if you're not willing to do it, Courtney is, and if you're not willing to do it, Virgil is. There's all kinds of substitutes. This sets up the concept of elasticity. Elasticity, technically, and it's represented by this kind of funky N, okay, elasticity, equals the percent change in labor as a function of the percent change in wage. So it's supposing that this is the elasticity of labor, or the wage elasticity of labor, and we're going to focus on labor demand. Now, everything we say, or almost everything we say, would be applicable to elasticity of labor supply, but we don't really talk in this course about labor supply, and elasticity of labor supply isn't terribly relevant in our labor market, okay? But labor demand is. Well, how do I find a percent change in a value? Well, I know I can use my basic percent change formula. I've got L2 minus L1 divided by L1, or some new level of labor minus an original level of labor divided by the original level of labor, and that's going to give me some decimal equivalency of the percent change in labor, right? Percent change in wage, I'll do it the same way. It's going to be W2 minus W1 divided by W1. Now I could say, to get a good elasticity or percentage, we multiply both of these by 100, which is true, but since we multiply both of them by 100, I can just go ahead and remove that because they cancel each other out. This is your simple equation for elasticity. In fact, this is called the simple formula. It's a simple formula. I'm going to introduce you to the midpoint formula as well, which differs slightly. Well, what's it really mean? When wages change, do they begat some change in the level of labor? Well, think about the labor demand curve. If our labor demand curve looked like this, when wage falls, let's say this was our initial condition here, when wage falls to WX, labor rises to LX, right? So when wage changes, it begats a change in labor. Or if we started at WX and went to W prime, it would also begat some change in labor, right? And because this is downward sloping, we know that as the wage change is positive, the labor change is negative, right? So we expect the wage elasticity of demand for a particular type of worker, a single type of worker, to be negative. The value that it's going to create is going to be negative, okay? Because in this case, L2 is less than L1 if W2 is greater than W1. When wages rose, labor fell. Okay. Well, we call this own wage elasticity, or own wage elasticity of labor demand, when I'm talking about the wages for one kind of worker and the number of that kind of worker. If I'm talking about the wages for one kind of worker and the number of labor units of a different kind of worker, that would be cross-wage elasticity. Own wage is when we're talking about both characteristics for a certain type of labor. Cross-wage is when we're talking about those characteristics with two different types of labor. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit further about each one of them. In this case, you might argue this perfectly elastic condition. Well, when I say elastic, what is it that's stretching? It's the number of labor units. At any wage, some change in wage brings about a change in labor. Okay? So what's stretching here, what is elastic, is the number of labor units. Wages are not what we think of as the elastic part of this. I wish I had brought a rubber band with me, but I neglected to do so. Is it feasible, Bailey, you look like you're kind of strong. Could you, no, I think you probably are. I don't want to arm wrestle you because I don't want to be humiliated in front of the video camera. Is it feasible that if you grabbed this pen and pulled on both ends of it, if you were strong enough, would it stretch?
Yeah, no, it would probably just break.
Well, but it would stretch a tiny microscopic bit before it broke, right?
Yeah.
So we would say that this is not very elastic, right? So a big change in the pressure brings about a very little change in the unit, the size of the unit. If I've got a rubber band, or a hair bind, or whatever it happens to be, a small amount of pressure brings about a big amount of change, right? Well, think of labor as the pen or the rubber band. When we had our perfectly inelastic scenario, a bit ago, any change in pressure, a lot of change in pressure, let's say we went from this W here, W1, all the way to W2, a big change in wage, does that bring any change in labor? No, we're still right on that demand curve. This is a demand relation. Okay? So it brings about zero change in labor, so very inelastic. If I need a brain surgeon, only a brain surgeon will do. They're not at all substitutable. My demand for them is inelastic. You can easily think about this in terms of some other things that are kind of medical related as well. If you're diabetic and you need insulin, will something that is not insulin satisfy you for more than just a very small period of time? No, you're going to die. We just know that. If you can't get some form of insulin and you are diabetic, you are going to die, especially if it's type 1, right? Well, for a diabetic, they have very limited demand for insulin, they have very set demand for insulin, almost regardless of what the price is. So sometimes the producers of insulin are motivated to keep increasing the price because they know it doesn't change the demand for it, because people are going to buy it, otherwise they're going to die, especially when you have health insurance that might pay the bill. But that's a health economic issue. Think about this in terms of the type of worker. Brain surgeons, ditch diggers, right? So if I change the wage for a ditch digger, I decrease the wage, well, I still might demand lots of them, right? Because at a lower wage, I demand lots of them. But if the wage of ditch diggers goes up above W prime, how many ditch diggers do I demand in this case? Zero. Because I'm going to go out, if I have to pay more, I'd rather go out and find a non-ditch digger, a framer, a mechanic, a salesperson, who could probably still dig a ditch. Maybe not as efficiently, but I'd rather pay this price and a little bit less efficiency than this price and more efficiency. So I have a very elastic. In fact, if we have perfect substitutability, we have perfect elasticity. If we have zero substitutability, we have perfect inelasticity. So inelastic, perfectly elastic. Okay? Well, we can model this pretty easily. But we would model it with a labor demand equation. Okay? When we're talking about the elasticity of labor demand, we do not use supply equations. It's one of the mistakes I see more often than any other when thinking about elasticity. I might give you a labor demand and a labor supply equation so that you can find an equilibrium, wage and labor, so that you can find the initial wage level and the initial labor level, right? But that's the only reason you're going to use the supply equation. To find changes, we're not going to use the supply equation. So let me grab an equation here real quick that helps me maybe think about this. Let's say my labor demand is 600 minus 4W. And let's say, for the sake of discussion, that W is equal to 20, such that labor demand at 20 is equal to 600 minus 80, or 520. So maybe that's weekly wages for a low to maybe little bit moderately skilled worker. Okay? So labor units and wage have to do with weekly. So 4.3 times this is their monthly wage. Okay? If this is our initial condition, I'm going to think of this as W1, and I'm going to think of that as L1. What happens when the wage changes to 30? Oh, not 30%, 30. Well, minus 4 times 30 is 120, and L becomes 500 minus 120, or 480. Now this is L2 and W2, right? We have initial condition and something we changed to. Most recent, what came before. I might say this is W0 and L0, and W1 and W2, just before and after, okay? Well, how much elasticity do I think exists here? And then, based upon the number for elasticity, what might I call it? Inelastic or elastic? Inelastic. Okay, so I'm going to run it into my equation. So I've got L2 of 480. Remember, I'm going to go my simple equation. So I've got 480 is L2 minus my initial condition was 520 divided by 520. And then I'm going to take my new wage of 30 minus my initial wage. 30 minus 20 divided by 20. And that sets up my L2 minus L1 divided by L1 and W2 minus W1 divided by W1. And it's going to give me some number. I think this is going to be a negative value because it's labor demand. I'm working off of this demand relationship, right? So I can always tell that it should be negative. So just how negative is it? Bury my calculator, or did I set it there somewhere? There it is. So I think I've got a change here of 40, but it's a negative 40, right? Negative 40 divided by 520 over 10 divided by 20. And I like to, when I calculate these, since I don't like complex fractions, I like to go ahead and take this and invert it and multiply them rather than divide them. It's just easier for me. If you're okay with complex quotients, knock yourself out, just work this. What I'm going to ask you to not do is turn this into something with a decimal equivalent where you might lose some fidelity because of the digits that you're going to be missing on a 2 or a 4 rounding until after you get to your final value, because you're going to find that can give you some pretty serious changes. But let's say that it's going to look like this. Negative 40 divided by 520 times 20 divided by 10. I can do that, right? Okay. Such that I've got negative 40 times 20, or 4 times 2 is 8. So I think that's negative 800 divided by 520 times 10, 5,200. And now you can go ahead and create a decimal equivalent. 8 divided by 52 is 0.1538, or 15.38%, you might think of it, but I don't want you to think about it in percentage terms. I only introduced this because we've done some percentages already. And as a quotient, which you might think of as a percentage, but I don't want you to functionally think of it that way. It doesn't work out as a percentage. It's a decimal equivalent. What we're going to do, though, is we're going to compare it to 1, to a standard of 1. And you'll see why in just a moment. Well, clearly, it's also negative. So a 50% change in wage begat a very small percent change in labor, didn't it? A big change in the pressure begat very little movement. Looks more inelastic than it does elastic, doesn't it? It's not perfectly inelastic, but it is relatively inelastic. Okay? If it had been just the other way around, if it had been a small change in wage begat a big percentage change in labor, that would have been more elastic than inelastic. So the rule that we think about is we're going to compare the absolute value of this to 1. I'm going to take the absolute value of the elasticity, because if it's negative, I want to get rid of the negative, so I'm comparing it to 1. and we can use the exact same rules for labor supply, where we would expect the outcome to be positive because the labor supply curve is upward sloping. Okay? Well, in this case, the absolute value of the negative 0.1538 is equal to 0.1538, and it is less than 1. When the elasticity is less than 1, it is inelastic. When we can think about it in this case, or rather the absolute value of the elasticity is less than 1. When the absolute value of the elasticity value is less than 1, it's inelastic. When the absolute value is greater than 1, it's elastic. Another way of thinking about this is when the demand for a type of worker is inelastic because that worker is not easily substitutable, then it's an inelastic worker. And it's going to come up with a elasticity value less than the absolute value of which is less than 1. Please.
So when we say inelastic, though, that doesn't mean that there's no change unless it's perfectly inelastic. It just means there's very little.
Yeah, and in this case, there was very little change, right? If it had been perfectly elastic, we could have had any change in wage and it wouldn't have created any change in the workers.
Okay.
But even a brain surgeon, we talk about them as being perfectly elastic. But if the brain surgeon came in and said, fine, happy to dig the ditch in your head, $27 million. I want it in cash before I do anything. Are you able to pay that? No. Your insurance company won't pay it. You won't pay it. You can't. And so all of a sudden, that change in wage shows that it's not really perfectly. Please, Libby.
Maybe we'll off topic with this, but supply obviously influences it, because if there's tons of brain surgeons in the market, and I need brain surgery, like, I'm now the competitor, right? Like,
Sure.
I can now pick the best value for price.
Right. So let's think about brain surgeons for a minute. Or we could say attorneys, or we could say CEOs, lots of things where there's not that many of them that are qualified, okay? Well, why is that? Well, because it takes a lot of experience, a lot of education, a lot of practice, unfortunately, to be a good brain surgeon, right? They're not very substitutable. So typically, a worker with an inelastic labor demand, there's not going to be very many of them in a marketplace. It's hard to create them. They're not very substitutable. Whereas in almost any marketplace, you'll find lots of low-skilled manual workers. Now that may not always be the case. North Dakota, up until, for about a 7-year stretch up until very recently, offered an example that was contrary to this. If I went up to North Dakota and I was a manual labor worker down here in Salt Lake during the oil boom up there and the gas boom, which isn't gone, but it's not as ferocious as it was, me and my low skill level, I could earn $70,000, $80,000, $100,000 a year because they needed people on rigs so badly. And you had people going up there that were not very highly paid here. They were very substitutable, but all of a sudden they were making a lot of money. And you would think that they made a lot of money because they weren't substitutable, but that wasn't the case there. They were substitutable, there just weren't enough people to substitute them for them. You have environments where you have a lot of really highly skilled people. Take Silicon Valley at the moment, San Francisco to San Jose area in California. I think that we would probably agree that there is a high number of high-tech workers. They flock there, wages are high there, etc. If you took the high-tech industry away from there, the high-tech workers are still there, but they're working at Walmart and McDonald's and wherever just to find a job, right? So you can theorize scenarios where the substitutability and pay issue falls apart, but they're unusual, they're odd. The more substitutable a worker is, the less we're willing to pay for them. Because why would I pay Courtney, who wants $20 an hour, when Virgil will do it for 18? And they're nearly similar workers. Oh yeah, Virgil's an auto mechanic, and Courtney is a plumber. But you know, with very little training, Virgil, we can teach you to be a plumber, right? So form of manual labor with some required skill. Okay, in a few weeks, you can start doing some plumbing. For heaven's sakes, I can do some plumbing. You don't necessarily want to live in the house where I did all the plumbing, but I can do some for a little while, right? It'll leak after a bit. So that's substitutability. Let's think about complementarity, though. Can we agree that some forms of labor are more perfectly substitutable for others, and than yet others would be?
Is it was a review question about that, right?
I think it's a review question.
Agricultural workers do better in a factory than others might.
Maybe. So let's think about what might be good and bad substitutes. I'm pretty sure that if I'm on a construction site and there are manual laborers on that construction site and there are framers, okay, putting up the sticks that make the building, is it likely that a framer couldn't easily do the rest of the manual labor on a construction site? Cleaning up, dealing with trash, digging the ditch? Yeah. Is it likely that most ditch diggers or manual laborers on a construction site can fairly easily know how to grab a hammer, use a saw, and put up the sticks to put up the building? Sure. Very little training. In fact, they probably have been watching other people do it long enough they already know how, they're just not being paid to do it. So lots of substitutability there, right? If I'm an electrician on a construction site, am I easily substitutable for a plumber? No. I mean, what makes a good electrician and what makes a good plumber are so different. Oh yeah, with some training and such, sure, I can figure it out. But I'm not immediately easily substitutable. Water tends to run through things differently than electricity tends to run through things. And not doing either of them well creates different types of problems, right? Fire versus flood. But if I'm building more and more houses, I need more and more plumbers, right? And if I need more and more plumbers, is it likely that I also need more and more electricians? Remember, I'm building more and more houses. So the same thing that caused me to need more plumbers probably causes me to need more electricians. Plumbers and electricians in this case, excuse me, are complementary. If you need more of one, you probably need more of another. Think about it in the simplest consumer terms. If I am going to have people consume more hot dogs, I need more buns, right? So hot dogs and buns would be complementary. If I have more tires being sold, I probably need more tire workers. I probably need more wheel producers as well. They're complementary. Hot dogs and hamburgers, though, are substitutable, right? They're both forms of relatively inexpensive protein that satisfies some hunger and some taste preferences. So part of this is the ability to think about what is a substitutable good or worker, in this case, versus what is a complementary good or worker. And we deal with complements and substitutes the same way. So I want to think through what happens in the elasticity relationship when we're dealing with a substitute versus dealing with a complement. Okay? Think about this for a minute. Bless you. If the wage of plumbers, so W plumber, goes up, what happens to the demand for plumbers?
Goes down.
Goes down. So fewer of them, right? If plumbers and electricians are complements of each other. When we need one, we very often have a reason to need the other, because we're in a new construction market in this case. If we need fewer plumbers, do we need more electricians or fewer electricians? We probably also need fewer. So when the wage of one went up, the level of labor for the other went down. Complements have a negative relationship, just like own wage elasticity. But now, since I'm dealing with the wage of one and the labor units of another, I'm dealing with cross wage, not own wage, right? Remember how I defined own wage a few minutes ago? Own wage is when it's plumbers and plumbers. Cross wage is when it's plumbers and electricians, or one type of worker or another. You'll see this in the videos as I say worker I and worker J, instead of worker P and worker E. They're different. Versus if it was own wage, it would be worker I and wage I. Okay? So this would be an example of a complement, where with a wage for one of them goes up, the number of units of that goes down, and the number of units of the other one goes down. We can think about this slightly differently as well. If the wages for plumbers go up, what happens to the price of the house they're building? It also goes up, right? Unless the construction company is going to accept less profit or maybe a loss. Well, if the price goes up, what happens to the number of houses we're building? Goes down. If we're building fewer houses, do we need more or less electricians? We need less. So you can think about it by running it through their common element, or you can just think about it like this. Let's consider then substitutes. So if the wage of a, let's say, fast food worker goes up, the number of fast food workers goes down, right? Because we're dealing with demand. If we have a marketplace in which retail clerks could also be easily substituted for fast food workers, I think that's probably true. Not a tremendous amount of skill set difference for your basic retail worker, the Walmart, Kmart, Sears kind of thing. And if the demand for fast food didn't change, what would happen to the labor of retail workers? Well, if they're substitutable, and I need fewer of these, let's say they both made the same amount. WF and W retail were the same number. Okay? If I want fewer of these because their wage went up, and my demand for these workers generally has not changed, I'm going to start to use some of these workers instead of these, right? So this fell, and this rose. Because the demand for that type of worker didn't change. It was just the wage that changed. And so I'm going to hire fewer of them, and I'm going to go over to retail workers and start to hire them instead. Because I just need a modestly skilled person. These are substitutes. We think a fast food worker and a retail worker can probably substitute each other relatively easily. So, wage up, number of workers up, you would expect the sign of the elasticity quotient for substitutes, again, cross wage, not own wage, to be positive. Does that make sense? If you had a labor supply and demand equation that you then used to figure out the initial conditions, and you also then were given a new supply, maybe, or maybe demand equation that brought about changed conditions, you could think about W1 and W2, or W star and W2. W1 and W star would be the same thing, right? Initial change. And you could think about L1 and L2. Own wage is when we're dealing with a type of workers, change in wage and change in labor units. Cross wage is when we're dealing with two different types of workers, change in wage and change in labor units. And when we're dealing with cross wage, we either have complements or we have substitutes. And we use the absolute value of the elasticity quotient and compare the absolute value against 1. When the absolute value is less than 1, we call it inelastic. When it's greater than 1, we call it elastic. And when it equals 1, we call it unit elastic or unitary. And when it's equal to 1, that means that a given change in labor, a percent change in labor, is met by the exact same percent change in wage. Or excuse me, I said that backward. A given percent change in wage is met by the exact same percent change in labor, such that the numerator and denominator have the same absolute value, and the absolute value then of the two combined is 1.
So
Cal?
when you're doing the cross wage elasticity, you still use the actual number that it generates to like determine if it's elastic opposed to the
Yeah.
other worker's wage? Okay.
We're going to use we're going to use the exact same equation. The equation doesn't change at all. I'm going to introduce another equation to you in a moment and explain how and why we might use it, but it's precious little difference. But cross wage, own wage, same equation. Complements, substitutes, same equation. But for a complement, we would expect the sign of the value to be negative. For a substitute, we would expect the sign to be positive. But these are cross wage, right? They must be. Otherwise, we don't have the concept of substitutability or complementarity.
So, but it measures how elastic it is to a different person's wage, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, to a different type of worker.
right.
So the change of wage for one begets a change of labor for another. And it's the elasticity of the labor units, the elasticity of the labor demand that we're really concerned about.
So is there like, can you think of an example where like, if it's your own wage elasticity, maybe it's not very elastic, but if it's cross wage, it's really elastic kind of thing? Does that make sense?
Let me think about that for a second. I think generally, because we use the absolute value and the sign becomes irrelevant, if there is an own wage, let's say wage for the plumber and the labor units for the plumber, if that were shown to be only modestly elastic, which let's face it, there is a skill level here, right?
Yeah.
Okay. That probably would be only modestly elastic, so it would only be somewhat greater than 1 when we took the absolute value. I think that we would expect for the electrician, it would also be modestly elastic.
Okay.
And the value we have going from the wage of one to the level of labor of the other, when they're good complements, is probably not going to be meaningfully different than the value we got initially, which is lead at 1, only its sign will be different. But we get rid of the sign when we put it into the absolute value framework. Does that help?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Lindy, you got kind of the head cocked this way, like I can't tell if you're thinking about it or you're thinking, I don't know what he's talking about.
No, I got it.
Okay, all right.
Thanks for asking.
Okay, sure. What else do I want to say about elasticity? Oh, I want to show you the other equation. There is another equational form referred to as the midpoint formula. If this is a simple formula, the midpoint formula is like this. L2 minus L1 divided by L2 plus L1 divided by 2. And all that divided by W2 minus W1 divided by W2 plus W1 divided by 2. This is the midpoint formula. I give some graphic representation in the videos on these. I don't know how important that is. It's not that explanatory. There's nothing that I expect you to recreate like our labor market graphics. But let me suggest that when you use the midpoint formula, you get a slightly more accurate elasticity quotient. Complementarity, substitutability, own, cross, etc., none of that changes. Labor, if this is demand, we expect this to be negative if it's own wage. Where we're looking at the change in wage for a type of worker versus the change in labor for the exact same type of worker. We expect it to be negative if it's demand and positive if it's supply. If it's cross wage, where we're looking at the wage of one type versus the labor of another, then if they are complements, we expect the sign to be negative. If they are substitutes, we expect the sign to be positive. And we use the same decision criteria, the absolute value of the quotient, and we compare the absolute value to 1. If it's less than 1, it's inelastic. Greater than 1, it's elastic. If it's equal to 1, it's unit elastic. Which we don't come across unit elasticity very much, by the way. So all it is a slightly different way of calculating it. And because of that algebraic change, it's slightly more accurate. Especially when the change in wage starts to get big. I would tell you that on an exam, I would either specifically say, calculate this with the simple equation or calculate this with the midpoint equation, or maybe I ask you to do both. Or if on an exam I say, calculate this with the most accurate formula, then you want to use the midpoint formula. If I don't say one of those things, if I just leave it up to you, then you can and probably would choose to use the simple formula because it is simpler, right? Pretty much as easy as that. When we get a big change in labor, or rather wage, and that kind of aggravates or makes more obtuse the change in labor, then the closer our number is to 1, or the absolute value of our number is to 1, the more motivated we are to go to the more accurate equation, because maybe it has created the difference between being inelastic or elastic. If I did this, and it gave me negative 0.98, well, or rather I use it simple, and it gave me negative 0.98. That's not very different than 1. You could argue, Bailey, that it's slightly inelastic, right? But only slightly. Wouldn't take much of a change for this to be 1 or greater than 1, right? So I might be motivated when I'm that close to 1 to also use the midpoint formula, which I know is more accurate. It's conceivable that the midpoint formula equals negative 1.01. So that greater accuracy may be important to us. And it's largely going to be an issue of when we have a big change in wage. I think I go through this pretty well in the equations. I think if you get the concept, the equational structure is fairly simple. What kind of questions would you have? Please.
For those elasticity equations, is that always labor and wage, or?
It's always labor and wage.
Okay.
Always labor and wage. A very common mistake I see is people inverting this and putting wage in the numerator and labor in the denominator. It'll kill you. It'll kill you. Okay? So don't make that mistake. It's always labor and wage, and cross is when they're for two different types. One is when they're for one type. Okay. So if I asked you, if you have a modestly skilled worker making $9 an hour, would you expect that modestly skilled worker to have an elastic or an inelastic elasticity quotient? I'm sorry, did you say something, Wendy?
I said elastic.
Okay, I agree. How come?
Well, I think it's stuck in my head the way that you described, like inelastic or highly educated or masters of their particular fields. Maybe that doesn't go across all scenarios, but it's what connected the dots between inelastic and elastic.
I agree. Think about substitutability as well. When something is easily substitutable, and I don't need to use a particular type, I can use almost any type, I pay less for it, right? Why is it that fast food workers make so little? Because in our marketplace, almost anybody, even a teenager, can be a fast food worker, right? Same reason that retail clerks at run-of-the-mill retail stores don't make much money. Retail clerks at very high-level art galleries may make quite a lot of money, but they have to have a skill level that you don't need when you are a retail clerk at Target, right? Cooks at Wendy's don't make a lot of money, but the chef at Lakai or Tiburon or one of the other nicer restaurants in the area may make rather a lot, because the skill level that is necessary is very different. The higher the skill level, the lesser the substitutability, the higher the wage. And more likely they are to be inelastic. The lower the skill level, the lower the wage, the greater the substitutability, the more likely they are to have elasticity of demand be more and more elastic.